Good afternoon, friends. It's a pleasure to have with us Manreet Sodhi Someshwar, our award-winning author. As many of our viewers know, Manreet had won the PFC VoW Book Award in 2020 for her excellent book, The Radiance of a Thousand Suns. In fact, this Partition Trilogy, starting with Lahore, is in many ways a continuation of that book. And one of the remarkable features of Manreet's writings is that she has interwoven the ancient text of Mahabharata into any story that she weaves about Bharat. In fact, one of the famous lines from her book there was that nothing which has not happened in Mahabharata will ever happen again, because such was the story which Ved Vyas has brought about. And the Radiance of a Thousand Suns also had two parallel stories running. There was the Mahabharata story that was running, and there was the story, and I will not reveal all details of that story, but this was about partition, about how a family suffered multiple partitions, first in 47 and then again in Punjab during the violence, and then 1984. But today we're going to be talking about her book Lahore, which is a remarkable book because this is also many stories. There's a story of families in Lahore, ordinary people. There's a rickshaw puller, there's a coolie. There is, in fact, a strong bond of friendship between the coolies. There's a clerk in the railways. And it's also the story of life in the Viceroy's household. There's a story of Nehru, there's a story of Patel, there's a story of Radcliffe, and there's so many stories that are woven around here. And it also tells us about how ephemeral power is. And before I invite Manreet to first talk to us about her book, and also perhaps about the next two books in this series, I think it'll be appropriate to start with how ephemeral power is, and I'll quote I'll quote Habib Jaleb, when he said कि तुमसे पहले जो शख्स यहाँ तख्ते नशीं था, तुमसे पहले जो शख्स यहाँ तख्ते नशीं था, उसको भी अपने खुदा होने का इतना ही यकीन था. And Manreet describes it, that a person, whoever occupies the throne, feels that, he has got tremendous power, little realizing that power is also transitory. Welcome, Manreet, to the NDLI WoW Afternoons with an Author. Over to you. I'll give the first 10 minutes to you to describe this book, and then I'll be in conversation. And after about 40 minutes, there'll be questions from the viewers. Mr. Verma will be curating those questions, which will come on the YouTube and the Facebook, and then I'll request you to respond to them.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Sanjeev, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who is tuned in and watching this afternoon. It's really a privilege to be back at Valley Awards, whereas, as Sanjeev mentioned, I was fortunate to win an award for my previous book, The Radiance of a Thousand Suns. And my new book, latest, is Lahore, for some of you who may not have seen it or had a chance to read it yet. And as Sanjeev rightly said, Lahore is in many ways a continuation of the themes that I explored in Radiance. It is many ways also a spiritual sort of prequel, you could say, to Radiance. In Radiance of a Thousand Suns, I look at a very wide canvas, almost a 75, 80-year canvas, where the narrative arc begins with the partition of India, and that covers sort of epochal events in the life of a Sikh family, so 1984 figures, and I also bring in the diaspora in New York City, and therefore 9/11 also plays a part. And really what I'm trying to see there is how we are caught in a spiral of violence, how once we are trapped, it's very difficult to break out of it. And once, when I was conceptualizing the idea for Radiance, which has been now several years in the making, because these books have required a very heavy amount of research, because I was interested in two things. I was interested in how the aam aadmi and aurat, the ordinary people, were impacted by sort of these epochal events which literally tore the earth from under their feet and had them divided and fleeing in the direction of what they believed their homeland should be as defined by their religion, their faith. And the other thing I wanted to do was also try and look at our political leaders, those men, and they were really men, there weren't any women involved, who were taking the decisions which had such huge impact on the lives of ordinary people. And and that's why the idea of looking at the run up to the partition, independence and partition of India, and the impact thereafter. When I conceived this project, it was obviously epic in scale, because I'm talking about, as I said, momentous events. I'm also talking about uh, the myriad people impacted by it. We know that the partition of the subcontinent is seen as the largest migration in modern human history. And I realized at that time that it would be very difficult to contain all of that in one book. And therefore, I decided to sort of split the narrative in two parts. I first tackled the impact of partition and thereafter in, as I said, the radiance of a thousand suns. And then I turned my attention to, the run up to the partition of India, and which is where Lahore comes in. So Lahore is set in the time period when the last viceroy, Dicky Mountbatten, um, lands in India, which was in February of 1947. And the narrative arc continues all the way to September of 1947. So in the immediate month following 15th of August. And at this time period, I was interested in who are the political leaders who are involved in the direct negotiations with Dicky Mountbatten. And for that reason, I chose Vallabhbhai Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru, respectively the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister in the interim government, who were directly involved with the negotiations for India's independence. And I did make a very conscious decision not to have sort of two men who loom very large in our history, who is the Mahatma, the great soul, and the Qaid-e-Azam, who's the great leader. And it was a conscious choice to keep them as figures in the background, because there can be no story of India's independence which doesn't have these men in some form. But I chose to keep them in the background and not have them as direct protagonists, for a simple reason that I believe that a lot has been written about them already, a lot that if we apply ourselves to the material that is available there, that we can learn. But I do feel that enough has not been written about what Vallabhbhai Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru were doing in those months leading up to the partition. What were the day-to-day challenges that they were facing? How were they negotiating and facing up to this humongous task of administrating what would be two new nations that would get created? And that is why these two people, along with Dicky Mountbatten, I have them as my protagonists. So for me, in the narrative, they are Jawahar, there is Vallabh, and there is Dicky. And it's a very conscious decision. I do hope when you get to read the book, you will get a flavor of what I am referring to. And as Sanjeev said, the other part, so the two narratives really broadly, one is the Delhi thread, which is where the political leaders are sitting. And the other thread is the city of Lahore, where daily speculation is mounting, that independence is coming. What does it mean? The idea that there is a talk of Pakistan. Is there a talk of Khalistan? Would there be a separate homeland for the Sikhs? Where will the Sikhs go? And how the ordinary person, when we do history and social studies, what we call the subaltern. I'm really not interested so much in the elites, because I think people who have access to resources, whether it's wealth or power, did find a way to an extent, escape the calamity that befell them. But the ordinary people, and as Sanjeev mentioned, I have two men, which is Mahmood and Beli Ram, who kind of have been raised in the same family. So one is a Hindu, the other is a Muslim, but they are sort of brothers. And they work as coolies at Lahore railway station. And Lahore railway station, as we know, was a site of this great battlefield that had really erupted in Punjab between brothers. And I have Sepoy Malik, who has returned from fighting in World War II, as a lot of young men were at that time in Punjab, who still had their weapons with them and who took very active part in the violence that erupted in the months leading up to and following partition. And Sepoy Malik again is his beloved is a woman called Tara. And then I have Kishan Singh, who is a clerk at the Lahore railway station. He's a mild mannered Sikh man who has three daughters. His wife passed away earlier, and he's trying to make sense of the cataclysm as well. And Kishan Singh is kind of atheist. He likes the Communist Party. He's also a budding poet. And through all these characters, I'm trying to capture the frenzy that is sort of snowballing on a daily basis and the complete shock that these people are dealing with and their attempt to comprehend what partition would mean, where would the line get drawn, what did it imply for their homes in the city of Lahore. And as Sanjeev said, the Mahabharat for me has been an enduring sort of leitmotif. It runs through the Radiance of a Thousand Suns. It will also run through the three books of the Partition Trilogy. And there is in fact, a very simple reason for it. During my sort of 20-year research, which has gone into these books that I have written and that I am writing, a lot of times when we are reading about the people who were directly impacted or involved in partition. So let's start with the political leaders, for instance. So Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, spent a lot of time as the horror of partition started building up, talking about how the Mahabharata was so much in our blood that he was foreseeing that brothers would turn against brother and we would have a great bloodbath. And it did turn out to be true. So, for instance, when after 15th August, there were kafilas which were fleeing in both directions, the non-Muslims fleeing towards the newly established India and the Muslims fleeing towards Pakistan. In the old fort, a lot of the Muslims were seeking at that time refuge before it became safe for them to have a passage to Pakistan. And when Bapu visited them, he actually said that he remembered an incident from the Mahabharata where the Pandavas are seeking shelter in the old fort, and he says life has come back a full circle. So in many ways, the Mahabharata is sort of this great epic. It is the fount of all our storytelling in the epic. And it is not unusual to find a parallel with what is happening in our life at a point in time, whether it's contemporary India right now or it's 1947, and to see a parallel from the Mahabharata. So, for instance, when we read the letters that the sepoys, that the soldiers were writing back home to India, to their parents, to their beloved, to their family, and these soldiers, whether they are fighting, seeing action in North Africa or in Europe, very often they would compare remember, these were young boys who had gone from Punjab, from the Gangetic Plains, from central India, who had never seen the kind of weaponry that they were seeing. And very often we see that then when they would see these bombs falling from the air, the closest they would say it was like Garuda. So it is normal for somebody to evoke what is familiar to them to describe what is unfamiliar. And I think, because I found so many references to this great epic, it just seemed natural for me that in my own storytelling, I should find a way to weave the Mahabharata. And as Ved Vyasa, who writes, he's sort of acknowledged in a sense as the writer of Mahabharata. We know, of course, there have been many sources which have fed into it. But Vyasa says, a bit pompously, but I think very accurately, that what is not is in the Mahabharata is nowhere else in the world. And therefore, I would encourage aspiring story writers that if you're ever short of
Short on a
inspiration,
plot, think of it. Think of
yes,
Mahabharata. In
yes,
fact,
turn to it.
even when you're describing Tara, and when Tara brings out her wedding saris, and the two wonderful expressions. One is this expression "pitemu," which is untranslatable. Which is untranslatable. I challenge you to translate it. and because the mother is saying that why are you wearing your wedding trousseau, and then of course even Sepoy Malik is telling her that why are you dressed up like Draupadi, and so it's a very powerful, so it runs through. But there are many words which you've used, pitemu, motialo, which give a very, very Lahori flavor to it. I mean, like you and me, we've never been to Lahore, but this is certainly current in Amritsar also. Motialo, Badshao, Pitemu, Dar Pitemu. Can
Yeah.
you just share with our readers, because both of us are Punjabis, but I think a lot of our listeners may not be Punjabis because it's being broadcast all over. So maybe you could tell us about the typical Punjabi expression that you've used.
Yes, thank you, Sanjeev. So as Sanjeev mentioned, so this is Lahore is book one of the Partition Trilogy, and there are two other books, Hyderabad and Kashmir, which the covers are there at the back, and they're not very visible, but you will get a chance. Hopefully, Hyderabad releases in September of this year, and Kashmir the September of next year. And the idea is that Lahore looks at the months leading up to independence and partition. And a lot of people are unaware that the humongous task of integrating the princely states into the new nation state of India was afoot before 15th August could dawn. However, when independence came, there were three states which were still to cast their weight with India. There was Junagadh, there was Hyderabad, and Kashmir. And Junagadh got resolved quickly enough, but Hyderabad took till the September of 1948. And Kashmir, as we know, is still an issue which is troubling the two nation states to this day. So I wanted to look at also those two because I feel the story of Hyderabad has been completely forgotten, whereas the story of Kashmir is imbued with so much which may not be uh, factual to what was happening at that time. And therefore, it is my attempt again to continue with the threads. There is a Delhi thread where Vallabhbhai Patel, who's now the Deputy Prime Minister and the Home Minister in the government of India, and Jawaharlal Nehru, and Dickie Mountbatten, who actually stayed on for a year as the Governor General of the new independent nation of India. So I'm looking at that, and the other thread would be in Hyderabad. Similarly, in Kashmir, the other thread is based in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And I was very clear that in each of these, I wanted to evoke and invoke the flavor of the local place. And as Sanjeev rightly said, I'm a Punjabi, so my task becomes a little easier in Lahore because while I have never been to Lahore, I grew up in the border town of Firozpur. And for a lot of people, this may be news, but Firozpur was a Muslim majority town. And by the laws of India's partition, it was supposed to go to Pakistan. But we will not get into all the speculation that has never been laid to rest. But Radcliffe's squiggle around the Firozpur salient ensured that Firozpur stayed within eastern Punjab and therefore India. And therefore, what it did was that literally overnight, and we know it, by late 1947, the large kafilas had mostly reached where they needed to reach. The sort of transfer of population had happened. So when I was a child growing up in Firozpur, this was kind of a fact. And one, as a child, one assumes that the way a Muslim majority area becomes non-Muslim majority, is a simple transfer of population. It's only as I grew up, heard stories, started paying attention to them, and then actually saw what is considered the lost decade of Punjab, which is the time of the Sikh militancy, which, as we know, is certainly at least 15 years, if not more. And I saw it very up close because my father was a criminal lawyer, and Firozpur was considered sort of a terrorist hotbed. And the people in my town said it's 47 all over again. And to cut a long story short, what I'm trying to say is that I realized that every household in my hometown had a partition story to tell, if not more. In fact, my own home had so many stories to tell because my father came from a family of, agricultural land owners, and as was typical, the people who worked on the land were all Muslims. and stories of how overnight they were trying to ensure that they could give safe passage, provide these people help to transfer across to Lahore. But Lahore, Amritsar, and Firozpur kind of forms an isosceles triangle. Lahore and Amritsar are the famous sort of uh, cousins, and Firozpur has always been in the shadow. But I grew up in that shadow, and I grew up listening to the transmission from Pakistan TV because at that time the broadcast was superior and more. I guess the signal was stronger for us because we were so close to Lahore. And my father was a generation where he knew English and he learned Urdu. So he spoke Punjabi obviously, but he never wrote Punjabi. He had not been taught that script. And all I'm trying to say is that I grew up with a culture which didn't see the boundary line. I grew up with a culture where I was sort of both Lahori and Amritsari and wholly Punjabi. And therefore, I was trying to capture the flavor of that time, the flavor of undivided Punjab, the language that people spoke. And some of these phrases I heard my own Tayaji speaking, who was at that time studying in FC College Lahore, and his education was interrupted. And the book is dedicated to him. It's his name, which is on the dedication page. And all my stories of Lahore come from him. And he would regale us with these phrases. Quite a few of them are current in Punjab of today. I mean, there can be nothing, no Punjabi who doesn't know Fitte Mu. And as Sanjeev said, there is no way I can translate that. You just have to be a Punjabi or live in Punjab to understand what that means. But Motia Alio, which is somebody who's beloved like a pearl, is an expression which was so widely used. It was an expression which was used to genuinely welcome somebody. It was an expression which was even used to placate somebody, let's say, who's very angry. It could be used by, a man for his beloved. It is also used in the book when Mehmood is caught by the Mozang gang, who was this actual men who wanted to get all the kuffars out of Lahore. And Mehmood, as we know, is sworn brothers with Beli Ram, who is a Hindu. And Mehmood is, at that time, they're threatening him. What are you doing with this Hindu man by your side? You need to convert him. And at that time, when Mehmood is trying to placate him, he uses the phrase "motialio." I was trying to get the flavor of that time of Punjab into the books, and I'm also trying to do that in Hyderabad and in Kashmir. And as I said, I'm not native to these places, but I feel that if one is genuinely interested in the culture and the history of a place, then one finds ways to understand, what it means to be, for instance, a Hyderabadi, or what it means to be a Kashmiri, and what it means to, uh, by no choice of your own, by no volition of your own, to be suddenly caught in events which are so much bigger than you are, and which is what happens when events like 1947 happen. History is sort of this charger which is galloping towards a date you have set, and then people are all just caught in this swirl. And it is my attempt with these books to put a lens on all these lives, ordinary lives as we call them. But you, I, all of us listeners, we are those ordinary people. We are the descendants of all those ordinary people who were caught in those tumultuous times. And yeah, really, that's, I feel, language is one way to capture all the all that feelings that we are trying to articulate, whether it's terror or love or camaraderie or friendship, with others.
Thank you so much, Manreet, and I'm so glad that you've taken us through what's going to happen in Hyderabad and what's happening in Kashmir, Jammu Kashmir. In fact, that brings me to this whole point about the political department and then the transition to the States Department and how Mr. Menon, who again deserves a lot of credit for the integration of Indian states. So, can you tell us? In fact, doesn't it become very clear that there was no unified thought. I mean, except for the Muslim League and Jinnah, who were very clear that this is what they want. As far as Dicky Mountbatten and the British Empire or the Raj, even there was some confusion there because they were not very clear about whether Princess Khan should actually be or should not be, because there was certainly Mountbatten was did want India to survive, and he perhaps did not want the balkanization which Wavell may have thought. So, could you throw some light on this aspect? Because from an administrative point of view, this is very important. I mean, how the transition took place from the political affairs department, from the political department to the Department of States, and the role which Mr. Menon played. And also, in your book, you do not show the tensions between Nehru and Patel, but there were obviously a lot of tensions between Nehru and Patel, even as far as the integration of states is concerned. So, could you throw some light on this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Sanjeev. And so for as I said, a lot of people, when I have discussions that I've been having over Lahore with young people, the idea that the map that we see today, is the map that was given to us by the British before they were leaving, save the map of Pakistan, which was created, is a notion that we all have. And I feel that we need, as Indians, to understand that we cannot take that for granted. This is the map that we see is not the India that the British Empire, the Raj, was leaving behind. Certainly not. In fact, I would even go thus far to say that, in the aftermath of World War II, Britain had been bankrupted. And the idea of them governing India, the basic injustice of it had been shown because they had gone to war, the Allies, against Germany, which was an occupying force. So, literally the foundation for their arguments had been stripped away. And Attlee was very keen that Britain has to cut its losses and get out of India. And I would say that the territorial integrity of India was of little interest to them by that point in time. They wanted to ensure that all the white people, men, women, families, could escape, could leave India, and they hoped they could leave India in a relatively peaceful United States. But if it was not possible, then they would give the leaders what they needed to be satisfied. And as you mentioned, Jinnah was certainly in 1947 was very clear what the shape of Pakistan would look like. In fact, he even suggests that there should be a corridor between East and West Pakistan, and Patel rubbishes the idea right away. So Mr. V.P. Menon is one of the characters in the novel. He worked very actively with the Viceroy and with Vallabhbhai Patel. And his two excellent books, which he has written, one of them is called The Integration of the Indian States, has been sort of my Bible or my Mahabharata to go back again and again when I'm trying to get into what exactly was happening and what was the timeline and the dates, because he is so specific about all that. And as he mentions in the preface to his own book, that he's writing that book because Vallabhbhai Patel actually told him that Menon, once this job is done, make sure you write about it so that our children and our grandchildren know what went into creating modern India. And here I want to step back and tell the readers, some of whom may be unaware, that India consisted at that time of what was British India, which was territories which were directly governed by the Raj. And then there was the princely states, which were governed certainly by the Raj, but they had an intermediary there in the form of a resident, a British resident. For instance, Hyderabad and Kashmir were large princely states. But there were actually 565 princely states, all of which needed to be integrated into this nation state of India that we now take for granted. And it had to be done by 15th of August because otherwise, the leverage that could be exercised upon them would start to dissipate. The princely states had the option that they could go to Pakistan, they could go to India, or they could choose to remain independent. So this was a humongous task, which was in front of Vallabhbhai Patel as the Home Minister. And he had to cobble these states together into the nation state of India. So, for instance, almost half of these states were in what we currently know as the state of Gujarat. And so just imagine if you're driving from Ahmedabad to Baroda, and you will have probably 100 checkpoints, which would be
Yes.
customs and immigration checkpoints, where they would say, okay, show me your passport. Who are you? You're getting now entering the princely state of whatever, Kathiawad. And these were actually tiny principalities. They were feudatories a lot of times. But the fact is that they existed as princely states, and they were one of the 565. And really, majority of them, by far, were Hindu majority states. So they needed to go to India just by the laws of partition. And to incorporate this 565 states, to go to each of the princely rulers, or some of them were Rajas and Maharajas, and to say, you need to accede to India. And to offer the entire sort of arsenal of blandishments, the Motiyan Alio kind of, with each
Yeah.
one of them, to get them to agree, to sign to the line, to agree to be part of this new nation state of India was a humongous task. And as you mentioned, Sanjeev, this was a task which Jawaharlal Nehru was singularly ill equipped for. Nehru's inclinations were more socialistic. He had very little
Well, very little understanding of the
understanding of
administrative aspects of this. So I
yes,
think we were very fortunate to
yes,
have had Sardar Patel at that time.
yes.
But let's
And so
get back
that
to Lahore because we're talking about India and we'll get the chance to discuss this in a subsequent books. There is a story of Parminder and Pamela. Parminder being the daughter of Kishan Singh and Pamela being the daughter of the Mountbattens. So at some point of time, Pummy come together. Pummy and Pamela come together. And there's reading this book, Mill on the Floss. So can you just tell us about Parminder and his sisters and then link it to Pamela? And before we do that, there's one thing which I wanted to share with everyone, and that's something Manreet and I were just discussing, that in Punjab, daughters or sons, everybody is called Puttar, as if the son. It's something which happens, but is there something very deep about it, or is it just a matter of expression? While we discuss that, but I think telling the story of Parminder, Pummy, and Pamela and linking them up is, I think, a superb, part of the way the plot unveils itself.
Thank you, Sanjeev. So it's a two-part question. I will
Yes.
first deal with the Pamela and Mountbatten and Parminder, and then I'll try and answer the second part of it. Yes, so, Kishan Singh, who's a railway clerk, has three daughters, and the eldest of them is Parminder, who is affectionately called Pummy. And Pamela Mountbatten is, of course, Dickie Mountbatten's younger daughter, who was with them at the time of their stay in India, and has, in fact, written an excellent book, which I referred to, uh, which talks about her time with her parents in India at the time. And one of my attempts with Lahore, and certainly going forward with Hyderabad and Kashmir, is really to bring the women out of the interstices of history. Because, while there were these humongous decisions being taken by Vallabhbhai Patel, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Dickie Mountbatten, there is Maniben Patel, who was Vallabhbhai's daughter, secretary, diary keeper, homemaker, the one who, his nurse. There is so much that Maniben is doing, and she is such a large part of Vallabhbhai Patel's life, and yet there is so little that we hear about it. So I was very interested in seeing, when these men are taking these decisions, where are the women? What are they doing? Similarly, for Jawaharlal Nehru, there is at that time Indu, whom we know later as Indira Gandhi, who, with her two young sons, comes to stay with him because, as the interim prime minister, while he's dealing with all these challenges, he also has to entertain people for dinner with these leaders who are coming from neighboring states, from Europe, from overseas. And similarly, with Dickie Mountbatten, there are two women in his life at that time. One is the vicereine, which is Edwina Mountbatten, and then there is their daughter, 18-year-old Pamela Mountbatten. And both these women are actually engaged in their own way in serious responsibilities. Edwina Mountbatten's role has been so misunderstood because she did a tremendous amount of work with the refugees, with the people who were displaced, who were dispossessed. Because remember, this is a time when everybody's resources were being stretched. And Edwina took it upon herself to visit the refugee camps, to arrange for resources, to intercede with Jawaharlal Nehru, to get somebody's attention to things which needed to be done. Whether it was sanitation or blankets being made available as winter is approaching, or calling doctors and nurses to the refugee camps. And Pamela Mountbatten was both assisting her mother and also teaching the children in the school on the premises of the Viceroy House, where the staff sent their children, and also helping run the clinic, which was on the Viceroy estate. And, when I was reading about them and I realized the kind of work that Pamela Mountbatten was doing, without giving the story away, I want to say that Parminder, Pammi, lands in the refugee camp, which was set up on the Viceroy estate. And it is at this camp that, by a fortuitous turn of circumstances, because Pamela was called Pammy and Pammi is called Pammi, Pammi has been through a lot by the time she reaches the refugee camp. She is not talking, she's crying all the time. Most people assume that she's a deaf mute. But when she hears Pammy's name being called out, and her head jerks up because she is also Pammy, she's Pammi. And there is a point in time, I don't want to give the story away, but these two young women meet. And in my own way, I was trying to, as you said, connect the threads of the political and the personal. I was also trying to show how a lot of the sorrows of a woman's life are similar. It doesn't matter whether you are a white woman or you're a Punjabi girl. It doesn't matter whether you are the daughter of the viceroy or you're the daughter of a clerk. It doesn't matter, because a lot of time history, in its swathe, in its ferocious, furious turn of events where men sort of seem to play the large roles, women's sorrows, their stories, get sidelined. And in my narration, at least, I'm trying to get all those stories up front to make us as readers just pause and think about all those women in our lives who are there and whom we many times sort of forget to pay equal amount of attention to. And now coming to the second part of your question about the fact that we never call a daughter, for instance, putri. I have never heard it. My father always used to, in fact, say, "You're my sher putter," and um, which is so true. And I do agree that it is a form of patriarchy. The idea that the best that a daughter can be is that she can be a son. And it's a patriarchy that we have all lived with. It's a patriarchy which can be very benevolent if you are lucky. Um, it's a patriarchy that can be enlightened to an extent, because I do believe when I was being brought up, in a household of girls, my parents, who were both feminists, raised us to believe that we could be anything. And when you are in a patriarchal Punjab, anything means you can be like a boy, right? That's sort of the model, in a sense, for you there. I do believe that that is the case, but I do feel that there is a lot of love and affection that a father puts into it when they say, putter.
Yeah, but that's it's so unique because I don't think any other region of the country, in fact, because I've spent a lot of time in Bengal, there the Devi and the Ma, or the girl child is referred to as Ma,
Yeah.
which is a very great cultural sort of a difference between how you look at a young girl in Bengal and how do you look at a young girl in Punjab. And coming from good intention, I'm sure fathers have a special fondness for their daughters. So when they address their daughter as Ma or Mago in Bengal and they address them as Putter in Punjab, there's something. Now, there's a question which one of my colleagues is asking. That's about, Iqbal's interaction with Nehru. And when Iqbal asked him about, how is he different from Jinnah? Now, is there a historic basis to this? I mean, where do you get this this particular instance from of Iqbal's interaction with Nehru and the comparison of Nehru and Jinnah?
Well, there is certainly, as I said, was talking before the session started. Um, Lahore is kind of a curious mix of fiction and non-fiction, because to write the Delhi thread, I had to make sure that since my protagonists are Jawahar and Vallabh and Dicky, I have to make sure that whatever they are saying or thinking is something which has been documented before by historians, by record keepers, and therefore all of this is documented. Now I'll have to go back and see where exactly I got that reference from, but it could have been from one of the many sources. And if you look, the book actually has a select sort of bibliography at the end, and it is select because I could not mention by any stretch of imagination all the material that I have looked at. I think it could be from Frank Moray's biography of Jawaharlal Nehru. I'm not entirely sure. It could also be from Alex von Tunzelmann's Indian Summer. But, there is definitely this mention of when Jawaharlal Nehru is thinking about Jinnah's absolute adamancy that he will have Pakistan. And, that is really the state in the summer of 47, how the idea of Pakistan, people relate to Iqbal. And Nehru at that time is reminiscing about when Iqbal was on his deathbed. He asked to meet Jawaharlal Nehru, and that point in time, he tells him that he regrets the idea of this separate nation state. And at that point of time, Jawaharlal Nehru is kind of thinking about the irony of the fact that a man like Jinnah, who in many ways was, not a practicing Muslim, whose entire approach towards religion was kind of
Yeah.
atheistic, if one could say, ends up creating a homeland. In fact, creating is not the right word, because he's really carving out a homeland, because he is carving it out of the body of the subcontinent. He's carving a homeland for Muslims. And that is sort of the part, I think, that you're referring to, Sanjeev.
And you've also brought out the contrast between Maulana Azad, who was actually a
Yes,
very erudite scholar, in fact, more Muslim, a man of faith. And you
yes.
compare him to our friend Jinnah. So what a contrast! And here was a person who was believing in a secular India, and here was a non-practicing Muslim seeking to carve out a niche for himself. And that's something which is fascinating. I want to read a passage from your book because, this whole concept of being a nation state and being a civilizational state is something that I'm working on these days. It's something which is absolutely fascinating. We recently had some books on rights in a civilizational state, and I'd like to read for all of us here. This is from page 148, when Manreet writes, India had its own unity, a sense of a being that was beyond geography. From Cape Comorin in the south to Amarnath in the Himalayas, from Dwarka on the west coast and Puri on the eastern, the same ideas course through her. In the Mahabharata, of course, it has to be Mahabharata. She's- in the Mahabharata, a text from 2000 years ago, a very definitive attempt was made to emphasize the fundamental unity of India or Bharatvarsha from Bharat, Bharat, the legendary founder of the race. Indeed, Indian culture was so widespread that no part of the country could be called the heart of that culture, unlike, say, Rome for Italy. Though often broken up politically, her spirit always guarded a common heritage. I think these are some very powerful lines. Right? Let me congratulate you for these lines. And these lines also show such a strong sense of the nation state of India actually being part of a civilizational state. And Lahore,
Mm.
although it was not Rome, but Lahore has played its very important part in the larger civilizational story of India. So maybe you could talk about Lahore and the civilizational context of India.
Yeah, thank you,
In your own
Sanjeev.
way.
The praise for those lines goes directly to Pandit Nehru because they are drawn from his thoughts and his writing about India. At that point in time, and I totally agree with you. I think the while as Jawaharlal Nehru says, there is no sort of fixed center for India. I mean, India is India in its vast, sort of abundant geography. I would say certainly for Punjab, probably the beating heart continues to be Lahore. And even at the time of India's partition, Amritsar was sort of the commercial capital, right? That's where commerce and trade was happening. But Lahore was where the culture was, where the arts and a way of being was. And in fact, even the founding of Lahore is traced back to Lo, which we in the contemporary say love and Kush. Basically, the son, one of the sons of Ram, is what we trace the sort of origin and the founding of Lahore to. And Lahore is an ancient city. It is in many ways in the 19th century, 20th century was compared, it was called the Paris of the East. Because it was such a vibrant city. It was a city which had been open to cultures, obviously, because that is Punjab. And it had imbibed all of that. And anything that could be savored or sampled in the East could be found in Lahore. And Lahore was also the place which was sort of roughly equal in terms of the Muslims and the non-Muslims, in terms of the population numbers. And as I often tell people that in Lahore and certainly in Punjab, there were never ghettoization. There was never, oh, this is Muslim area, this is Hindu area, this is Sikh area. People lived cheek by jowl. People lived together, and that was why when it was increasingly becoming clear that for Jinnah's Pakistan to happen, Punjab will have to get divided in some form. And Governor Jenkins, Evan Jenkins, who was the governor of Punjab at that time, he said, and I used that to create a scene in the novel. He said will be wholly unnatural, and he compares it to
To the, yeah,
the
the Jewish
parable of
myths.
Solomon, where
You
there are
cut
these
the
two
baby into
mothers
two.
who came to King Solomon, who was considered a very wise and just king, and there are two mothers who come to him, both claiming that the baby is theirs. And he hears them out, and then Solomon says, "Okay, so let the baby be divided, and we give a half to each." And the woman who was actually the mother cries out and says, "No, no, you cannot split my baby. Give my baby to the other woman." And Governor Jenkins actually used this parable from, his belief, he was a Christian, to talk about how unnatural and how bloody the idea of partitioning Punjab would be. And I just want to point out to, again, it's to the readers who may be unaware that the idea for this nation state of Pakistan was actually born in the Gangetic Plain, which is where the Muslim League leaders, led by Liaquat Ali Khan, came up with the idea. And yet, the idea had to be implemented in two large states at the two extremities of India, Punjab and Bengal, whereas all the administrators, the governor of Bengal, the governor of Punjab,
Yes. Mhm.
firmly said over and over that these two states gain a lot from the mutual intermixing of these people, Hindus and Muslims in Bengal, and in Punjab, there is a third element, which was the Sikhs. And so it
And in
is one of
fact,
those. Sorry,
sorry,
please.
no, no, I just wanted to buttress your point that the Muslim League was not in a majority either in Punjab or in Bengal. So this
Exactly.
has been one of the greatest ironies, one of the greatest tragedies of history, one can say.
Yeah.
That, Muslim League got what it wanted in states where it was not powerful. I mean, neither the CM of Punjab, the Premier of Punjab, or the Premier of Bengal, they were both opposed to Mr. Jinnah, and Mr. Jinnah had very little hold over there.
Yeah.
In fact, when we'll discuss about Hyderabad and Kashmir, then we'll talk about other things. But two three other points. Some of these interesting factoids. And one somewhere you say that the name of the pet tortoise of Clive was Advait.
Yeah.
Now, where did you pick this fact up from? And why would Clive call his tortoise Advait? I don't know. Is this absolute fiction or is this
No,
based
no,
on something?
this is absolutely documented. As I
Okay.
said, I have spent 20 years, and once
Okay.
I set myself up the task that I needed to present uh, Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel and Dickie Mountbatten as actual flesh and blood characters. The only way I can do that is so what does Jawaharlal Nehru wear? What does he smoke? What does he drink? Does he do that or does he not do that? If he smokes, what is his favorite brand of cigarettes? What time does he wake up? What does he do during his day? What does his typical day look like? Is he fond of anything? Is he fond of animals? Who are his friends? So the reason I'm bringing it up is that it is one thing to be a historian, which is absolutely, you have to get all the data and the research and the facts. But it is quite another thing to be a novelist, because what a novelist does is to bring those people alive. And these are iconic figures. These are people who, especially if you're an Indian, and even if you're not an Indian, people like Jawaharlal Nehru are known the world over, as is Vallabhbhai Patel and Dickie Mountbatten. Now, a novelist come historian or come researcher can be fortunate if those people have left a lot of written material themselves. For instance, Jawaharlal Nehru has. Mahatma Gandhi, there are 100 volumes. If you want to learn more about the man, we can turn to his texts. But there are people like Vallabhbhai Patel, who was not a writer. Patel was not a person who wrote down his thoughts. He was an orator. He was a great orator. His speeches, but even those. So to get a handle on Vallabhbhai Patel, to get a handle on Moneyben, who's even less known, I have been, as I like to say, trawling the archives for 20 years, and I am, I any factoid that comes is when I start collecting them together and piecing them in place. So yes, when Vallabhbhai Patel thinks of Clive had a tortoise, and it was called Advaita, and it outlived Clive, like tortoises
Yeah.
tend to do. Their lifespan is longer than humans, and I think it was very much in character with Clive, you know, who was very much a person who outwardly would with the idea of India, things which are fundamental to India is something they would profess a certain familiarity with, a certain knowledge of. But whether they understood what it exactly meant was a different thing. And yes, so Clive's tortoise was called Advaita.
Okay, great. So now some quick questions to you. There have been so many novels on partition. I mean, Train to Pakistan, Jhootha Sach by Yashpal, there's Freedom at Midnight, there's Fikr Tawsi, the Sixth River, which is the partition novel or novella which you've liked the most, and why?
So my
Or
my
none of them?
I totally agree with you. There is such tremendous work. I mean, Yashpal's Jutta Sach, as you said, this is not that dawn, it has been a tremendous influence on me. But I
Yeah,
have to
because I
say,
could,
my
there was I mean, a very good description of the description of Lahore, which you see in Jhootha Sach, the lanes, the by
yes,
lanes,
yes,
there's so much of it there. And I think Yashpal is another author who's not really got his due
right,
so far. I mean, I
so
think,
far, yes. But to answer your question, my favorite really is still Train to Pakistan by Khushwant
okay,
Singh. And there is a very simple reason for this. The reason for it is that I came to Train to Pakistan much later in life. Um, and when I read Train to Pakistan, is when the realization struck that here was the history that I had grown up with, the history that I did not find in my textbooks. And the other thing is that, like any person in India, you grew up with a lot of British literature, right? When I read Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, I thought, oh, this is the way you write about Punjab. I like the way he used language to convey a sense of Punjab, Punjabiness, Punjabiyat, the way he molded his language to bring that flavor alive. So it really opened my eyes and ears about so many things, about partition and about the use of English as a language, which a Punjabi Indian writer can do.
absolutely. I think it's so important as this book that you write is going to be a very important addition to the literature on partition. And as you're aware that there is talk of also commemorating the Partition Day on 14th August. Uh, how do you feel about it? I mean, do you think we? I mean, I have had mixed feelings about the Partition Day. On whether it is whether it's not time to sort of, I mean, acknowledge it, but should we have a day dedicated to reliving and revisiting all these old sores, all these old wounds? I've not been very clear. I mean, I've not been able to make up my mind on whether Partition Day should be sort of commemorated as such, because something which I've certainly been telling a lot of people in my own classes. I've been saying that how do you look at 15th August from a British perspective? It was only the transfer of power. From certain perspectives, it was freedom at midnight. But the lived reality for people was partition, one,
Yes.
or the divide.
Yes.
Your quick thoughts on this, because we just got 2, 3, 4 minutes left now.
Yeah, I think it's such a weighty question. What do we do with partition? What do we do with the idea of partition 75 years down the line? And I feel that the first thing we can do is to recognize that partition is not in the past. It is very much our present. Its legacy lives on. It is there amongst us. And I think the first thing we need to do is to open our minds and our hearts to that, to the idea that every 15th August, while we celebrate and mark, and rightly so, the independence of India, we also need to take time out to think about partition and how its violence is a spiral that we're still caught in. And coming to the very specific question of 14th August as a day to commemorate, I am not in favor of it. I think if there is any way of, as I said, of marking that, it is by opening the border. If you really want to see what partition did and we want to um, make a peace with it, then the way to really do it is to open borders, to let people meet each other, let people go across and let people come here so that we can have an open dialogue. Because this is a festering wound, it is a wound which has not healed. And I think by choosing 14th August, which Pakistan sees as its Independence Day, as a way to mark partition, I don't think that's a way to build friendship. Because what we need to do now is to open the borders, say that we need to build bridges, we don't need to have more divisions between us. And I think when we take their Independence Day and say it is our partition day, we are in that direction. I wouldn't be for that approach. My approach is really that if we set the leaders aside, if it was only left to the people, the horrors of partition, we would be able to start leaving them behind us. So if I had any say in
That's
it,
a
I would say let
very,
people leave.
it's a very utopian thought to say that if we could leave the leaders behind. No, we cannot leave the leaders behind. It's so much a part of us, and we are all responsible. But anyway, I think before I ask you to give the last words, I like to quote Amrita Preetham, her famous lines on partition, which have really been so important and so significant. And she goes on to say that Ajakhan Waris Shah nu ut kabran vichon bol te aj kitabesh to agla war ka fol ਇੱਕ ਰੋਈ ਸੀ ਧੀ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੀ ਤੂੰ ਲਿਖ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਸਨ ਵੈਨ ਅੱਜ ਲੱਖਾਂ ਧੀਆਂ ਰੋਲਦੀਆਂ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਵਾਰਿਸ ਸ਼ਾਹ ਨੂੰ ਕਹਿਣ ਉੱਠ ਦਰਦਮੰਦਾ ਦਿਆ ਦਰਦਿਆ ਉੱਠ ਤੱਕ ਆਪਣਾ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਇੱਥੇ ਲੱਖਾਂ ਧੀਆਂ ਰੋਲਦੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਲਹੂ ਦੀ ਭਰੀ ਚਨਾਬ. So partition and the violence of partition, especially what it did to women, is something which we cannot forget, which we should not forget. And as Manreet is implying, forgive we may, but forgetfulness should never happen. So with these times and these words, we'll have to close our conversation because and there are a lot of questions, but we couldn't go to them. But last lines from you, and then we'll discuss Hyderabad and Kashmir whenever those books are launched.
Well, thank you so much, Sanjeev. This has been a great conversation. And I don't really know if I have any last words because I feel would like to mention is that, for instance, in Lahore, book one of the Partition Trilogy, um, the book begins and ends with a single word, and that word is run. And I want people to open the book and see why the entire narrative is encased in those two words. Because I do feel that it is only by engaging with those fabulous texts that you have already mentioned, by trying to speak to people who have either witnessed, lived with partition, our grandparents who have stories to tell, and by seeing what, certainly in the 75th year, that momentous event means for each one of us, I think that is the best way we can deal with the legacy of that epic event. So, thank you for hosting me and for giving Lahore this platform. I hope more readers get to read it and more readers get to engage with, what it means to be a free nation and independent people in the 75th year.
Thank you so much, Manreet. And with this, we'd also like to thank the National Digital Library of India for broadcasting it to all the things. We'd like to thank Garhwal Post, Technopack, Green Panel, Sochcast, and Coal India for being with us, for supporting us. Thank you, Manreet, for being with us. Thank you, Technopack. Great talking to all of us, and thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you.